Zelensky didn't get the tomahawks. Ukraine didn't get tomahawks from the United States. There's been a lot made of recent diplomatic overtures on the U.S.-Ukraine side and the NATO side, too. Here is how he responded to the threat of Russia at this point.
Part of President Trump's success with Israel and Hamas was that he applied pressure to all sides. Does President Trump need to get tougher with President Putin?
Yes, and even more. Putin is something similar, but more strong than Hamas. It's more bigger war.
Donald Trump had this to say about reports that there is a demand on Ukraine to cede large portions of the Donbass.
During that meeting, did you tell him he needed to cede all of the Donbass region to Russia?
No, we never discussed it. We think that what they should do is just stop at the lines where they are, the battle lines. You have a battle line right now. The rest is very tough to negotiate. If you're going to say, you take this, we take that, there's so many different permutations. So what I say is they should stop right now at the battle lines. Go home, stop killing people, and be done.
What do you think should happen with the Donbass region then?
Let it be cut the way it is. It's cut up right now. I think 78% of the land is already taken by Russia. You leave it the way it is right now. They can negotiate something later on down the line.
Constant swings on the U.S. part, continue the conflict, try to freeze the conflict. And of course, Zelensky just that interview alone, almost speechless on how Ukraine should actually respond. He's rejecting all of this. Zelensky's rejecting any kind of overture towards ceding Donbass.
You talked about swings. You've just seen one from Trump back in the summer when he met Putin in Alaska. He said that he accepted that there wouldn't be a ceasefire. And what needed to happen was that the two sides, even as the war was going on, needed to go sit down and negotiate and come to an agreement with each other. And now he's saying the exact opposite. There should be a ceasefire. And then after the ceasefire, there should be negotiations. Something which, of course, the Russians have consistently and repeatedly rejected and which they will never agree to. So you can see that Trump says one thing one day, something completely different the next. The reports, and I believe, by the way, these reports, I believe the reports more than I believe what Trump is saying. What a surprise. I believe the reports that, in fact, over the course of that meeting, Trump did tell Zelensky, look, you've got to accept that you're going to lose Donbass and withdraw. But it's one thing one day, it's something completely different the next. I don't think that Trump himself knows how to deal with this. And if you go back to what Zelensky was saying and to what the interviewer said to Zelensky, you immediately see the problem, because she asked Zelensky about succeeding in bringing about peace by putting pressure on both sides. But the problem is Trump is not in a position to put significant pressure on the Russians. The Russians are a major power. They have strong allies in China and India. There have been attempts to try to get the Russians to put pressure on them through sanctions and tariffs. That's been going on, well, certainly since 2022, and in fact, since 2014, and that hasn't achieved anything. We've seen endless arms supplies to Ukraine, and that hasn't achieved anything either. And the Russians are still winning. So the formula, put more pressure on Russia, put more pressure on Putin, is basically a formula to do the same thing all over again, which has failed already. And one can understand maybe why Trump himself, in his clearer moments, might see that this formula isn't going to work.
What's so interesting about this, Alexander, is that you have Ukraine and NATO now adopting what Zelensky immediately after his most recent conversation with Donald Trump immediately turned to Europe and said, we need to step it up, that we need to replace what the U.S. is no longer providing, because as I understand it, there actually has been, while it's not official policy per se, there has been a dramatic decrease in support for Ukraine, regardless of the reasons. And you can talk about what those reasons may be. But at the end of the day, it seems like Europe is the one left to scramble, while at the same time having to receive and get everything from the United States that it needs to provide Ukraine. It feels like a very desperate situation.
Well, indeed, it is a very desperate situation, because this is why we are here in this place where we are. While Zelensky gives these interviews and looks extremely unhappy, by the way, over the course of those interviews, why Trump says these completely contradictory things, very much like you said at the introduction of this program. I mean, these wild mood swings, the sense of clear unhappiness and worry, because everything has been tried up to this time and nothing has worked. Now, the Europeans know perfectly well that they do not have the industrial base to supply weapons to Ukraine on anything like the kind of scale that this war would require. The Europeans have talked about providing Ukraine with shells. They haven't been able to, not in anything like the quantities needed. There's been all kind of talk about drone fleets that the Europeans were going to send. That never materialized. We're talking about tanks. Europe doesn't apparently build any tanks. It hasn't done so for many years now. Apparently, and I only found this out from The Economist, neither does the United States. The tanks the United States has are in stocks, and they have to refurbish them every so often, and refurbishing each tank apparently takes 2 years to do. So there is this critical shortage of weapons that can be supplied to Ukraine. I was reading recently in, I think it was the American media again, that there was this talk a few weeks ago about creating a no-fly zone or shooting down Russian missiles and drones in Western Ukraine, and Western Air Forces participating in doing that. And it was quickly acknowledged that if they did do that, within a few weeks, the West would run out of air-to-air missiles, because the Russians produce drones and missiles at such much greater numbers than the Western powers can do. So this is the problem. The problem is the Europeans can't take the slack that the Americans, used to have, and the Americans themselves are running into problems with weapons. Trump himself, by the way, and all kinds of other statements that he's also been making at about the same time, has been telling, our inventories are run down. Obviously, we give Ukraine what we have done, but at the end of the day, it's more important that we keep weapons for ourselves, because this is our priority. And if the United States had the ability to flood Ukraine with weapons and to match and exceed the supply of weapons that are coming from the Russian side, it would do so. So would the Europeans. And we wouldn't be having these discussions. And the situation in the war would be a completely different one. But after 4 years, we can see that they cannot. And that, by the way, is the single most important fact of all about this war.
What explains then the discrepancy? Because NATO, I see it all over the Western mainstream media. There's talks of preparing for Russia's invasion of broader NATO. And there's talks of doubling down, tripling down on Ukraine. And yet you have this kind of chaotic swing from the U.S. side, which has on a few instances, at least in terms of its public relations and its interactions with Europe, has said, no, this is your war now. But at the same time, as this is going on, this kind of rebranding of the war, the United States side is all over the place with its positioning, talking to Russia one day, being aggressive toward Russia, threatening new weapons, tomahawks, and pulling back. What is the reason for this to continue on this way? There is really no clear trajectory here other than what seems to happen at the default of is the war goes on, and all sides play at least some role in that.
Well, there is always a difference between the US and the Europeans. The US is a superpower. It has interests all over the world. It considers itself and presents itself to the world as being the world's most powerful country, and it retains agency and control over its decisions. The Europeans, by contrast, are not in that position at all. They are much smaller countries. Individually, none of them remotely can match the power of the United States. Collectively, they are not an effective counter to Russia, and they depend heavily on the Americans. And that gives the Europeans and the Americans profoundly different perspectives, because in theory, at least, if the United States said, look, Ukraine, we're not going to win here. The Russians have dominance. They're going to win. This is our moment to do a deal with the Russians, and we walk away and we focus on doing other things, starting wars in the Middle East, starting wars in the Caribbean, starting wars in East Asia. Well, the Americans, in theory, have the ability to do that. The Europeans, by contrast, have gone all in supporting Ukraine. If that happens, if the Americans move away, Ukraine loses, Russia wins, there is a massive defeat for the European powers who have been supporting Ukraine. And it is a defeat against an immensely powerful country, Russia, which is their neighbor. One of the European leaders, I think it was Donald Tusk, who is the Prime Minister of Poland, put it very simply: a defeat for Ukraine is a defeat for Europe. So this is the difference. Now, when it comes to the United States, this is where I think we get into a whole set of problems created by US grand strategy, because the United States is a very, arguably still the world's most powerful country. But what it is seeing is that over the last 30, well, especially 20 years, the political geography of the world, if you like, has started to turn against it. So China has risen and grown enormously in power and wealth. Russia, after the crisis of the 90s, has recovered and is once again an important power again. China and Russia are working together. Other countries look like they are attracted to this new grouping that which has China and Russia at its core. So the United States is worried about that. It wants to break that new axis of power, if you like, down, to break it up. And it's been looking at the weaker part of this, and it decided, I think, some years ago that Russia was weaker than China, which it is, by the way, unquestionably. And so the idea was create a crisis with Russia, weaken Russia. Russia is already relatively weak. We can weaken it even further, and then that will break this new coalition that is beginning to develop between us. And what instead has happened is that instead of Russia getting weaker, it is the United States itself that has grown weaker out of this whole strategy, out of this whole approach. And the result is a crisis in Washington between those people who say, look, we can't give up now. We've invested so much in this. We've got such an interest in supporting Ukraine. If we give up now, we are conceding defeat to the other side. And that is going to have a massive impact on our position globally and on our ability to maintain ourselves as the world's leading power. And that's one very, very powerful constituency in the United States. And then there is the other constituency which says, well, look, this has gone as far as it can. We've got to call a stop. If we carry on doing this even further, the debacle that we're going to face is going to be worse still. And the result is that the United States tilts from one side to the next. It changes its position practically from one day to the next.
Everything that you said made me think about the reports. You probably saw them, Alexander, of when Zelensky met with Donald Trump in his most recent visit. And this has happened in multiple visits, in multiple talks that Zelensky has had with Trump, that it didn't go well, that there was yelling, that there was shouting, that there was maybe an incredible level of disrespect shown to Zelensky on the part of Donald Trump and his aides. Of course, this is all coming out from anonymous sources, but nonetheless, the results seem to speak for themselves. I'm wondering how much of this speaks to what you just said with the condition and state of the United States' foreign policy, its position in the world, given that it appears that Donald Trump and his administration may be seeking out new wars, whether it is what we're seeing in the Caribbean with the constant strikes on what Trump administration is calling narco-terrorists, what Colombia, Trinidad, Venezuela have said are ordinary civilians, some of which are being repatriated to their countries in this attack, for example, on the submarine in recent days. Talk about, if you could, what this is all about. This is Donald Trump seeking to, or is the administration more so, the U.S. as a broader power, seeking to shift its priorities? And that's why we see all this tension around Ukraine and maybe an inability to pull out, but a constant back and forth, trying to freeze the conflict, trying to do anything to free up the U.S. for other ventures.
Well, indeed. I mean, if we talk about the very angry meeting, that's the ultimate cause of that is not, Donald Trump's personality, that no doubt that played a part, and Zelensky's personality. It is that for the United States as a superpower, which still, as I said, likes to imagine itself as the great global hegemon, instead of Ukraine becoming a problem for Russia, which is probably what they imagined, it is increasingly becoming a problem for the United States. I'm not saying, actually, Ukraine is still a problem for Russia, but it is becoming even more of a problem for the United States, and a problem for which they don't have a simple, straightforward answer. I mean, they would like the conflict to freeze. They would like everything to stop and freeze where it is, because that would enable them to walk away. But the Russians aren't interested in it. They would perhaps also like the Ukrainians to come to some kind of terms with the Russians. But for their own political and domestic reasons, the Ukrainians aren't interested in that, nor are the Europeans. So this is what explains the tantrums, the anger, the threat, the maps on the floor, which is, what we've been told about. It's because of all of this sense that this is a situation which has just not worked out and which is now spiraling out of control. Now, as you know, I live in Britain. I live in London, the capital of the great world empire that existed before the United States. And one of the things that, if you are familiar with imperial history, is that as the British Empire began to sense that it was weakening, it needed, or felt that it needed, to become more aggressive and, if anything, more expansionist on the periphery. So the 1920s and 1930s witnessed a whole series of conflicts in the Arab world, in Africa, in all sorts of places, much, much more so than was true at the time of the British Empire's Victorian heyday. And the reason for this was twofold. Firstly, the people of the empire, the imperial people at the imperial center, want to do these things because they want to prove to themselves that they are still strong. And that is a factor that should never be underestimated. But even more important is the need to show to others that actually, despite the fact that there is a looming defeat on the horizon, the empire, the superpower remains strong. So you look for weak opponents, you look for weak adversaries, you pick on Venezuela, you talk about narco-terrorists, you do all of those kind of things. You pick fights where you don't have to, and you become more belligerent because you sense that things where they really matter are trickling away. Can I say, the conflict in Ukraine is obviously the big geopolitical, military, kinetic battle. The crisis with China, the trade war, the decision of the Chinese to tighten controls of exports of rare earths, the discovery by the United States that they have no effective counter to this. I think that is at least as important as the crisis in Ukraine. I think that has come as a profound shock. And you could see the alarm in the alternatively incredibly aggressive statements made towards China by the president and his senior officials, followed by ameliorative, concessive statements, and then you go back to being rude and aggressive again. And again, it's the same thing. It's not wanting to admit your weakness, wanting still to show that you are strong, and at the same time looking for other places where you can demonstrate your strength to tell the Chinese and the Russians and the Indians and the Indonesians and the Vietnamese and the South Americans and the Africans, don't count us out. We are strong still.
You're talking about Donald Trump and his administration becoming increasingly belligerent at times, especially toward China in this trade row that is not going away. Here's Donald Trump, what he had to say to the press about it very quickly.
China's going to buy soybeans. I want China to stop with the fentanyl. Very, normal things. I don't want them to play the rare earth game with us.
So doesn't want them to play the rare earth game with us. He says China is boycotting U.S. Soybeans. So blaming China for the harm of farmers. Meanwhile, Argentina is getting massive bailouts, and U.S. farmers are not getting any bailouts. So this is a big problem for Donald Trump. And economic growth in China, the recent quarter, 4.8%. The media is going crazy about how low that is. But industrial output is still very high, still meeting marks. Meanwhile, the United States is going through many different internal crises economically, which could explain why there is so much power projection in all forms of that word going on.
Well, absolutely. And of course, the other thing is that, and this comes across very clearly, the things that both Trump and Scott Bessent and the others have been saying, is that, of course, what China is now doing to the United States is what the United States has been doing to every other country since the 1940s. I mean, they've been imposing sanctions and tariffs. They've been regulating exports. They've been imposing export controls. Back in the 50s, I think it was, they set up the regulatory system to prevent exports of high technology goods to the Soviet Union and its allies. That has never gone away, by the way. There are still export restrictions, always have been, on high technology items to the Russians. And so all of that, in the 1980s, they stopped exports of computers and microchips to the Soviet Union. And now, shock, horror, the Chinese are doing the same thing to them. And, well, you can see that this is obviously violates the entire proper order of things. We must be able to do these things to others. It's absolutely unacceptable when they do this to us. My God, they're not even buying our soybeans. It's outrageous. And again, I mean, the fundamental problem, and this is what that set of comments from Trump showed, is that the United States really ultimately doesn't have a solution to this problem. Whatever Trump says, he cannot force China to buy American soybeans. If the Chinese want to buy soybeans from Argentina and Brazil, they will. If it is cheaper and makes economic sense for them to buy them from Argentina and Brazil, they will. You cannot force the Chinese to buy your soybeans, just as you can't force the Chinese to sell you their rare earths. So the United States is again confronted with a problem that it never imagined it would ever have to face and doesn't really know how to resolve.
One of the big, I think, red flags that through all of the administrations we've seen over the course of the last several decades in the United States talk about peace and ending wars and things like this, one big problem, it seems to me, is that the U.S., as a political and economic structure, really does depend on being able to dictate terms to others around the world. And we see that a lot even now with Trump making demands on Venezuela, these curious reports of Venezuela saying, we'll give up everything. And Trump saying, no, we're just going to keep on bombing and doing regime change on you. With China, you need to do X, Y, and Z for us, while offering absolutely nothing in return. And the same goes for Russia. The United States has said, well, Russia needs to do this. It needs to do that. It needs to stop killing. It needs to understand it's not doing as well on the battlefield. But overall, the approach is, we know what's best for you. We have the answers, quote unquote, and forget about history, which shows even now that when the U.S. is brokering something, let's say like what's happening in Gaza, doesn't turn out so well.
No, absolutely. That's entirely correct. And I mean, you're quite right about the United States not only assumes that it has the right to tell others what to do, but it has always assumed up to now that it has the power to compel others to do what it wants them to do. During the Cold War, there was an acceptance that there were two superpowers, and that the United States had to navigate around the Soviet Union carefully, because the Soviet Union, if not quite as powerful as the United States, was nonetheless still a force to be reckoned with and needed to be treated carefully. But since the Soviet Union collapsed, even that sense of self-restraint has gone. And it is very, very difficult for the United States now to accept that it is just one country, powerful admittedly, but one country amongst many, and one country amongst several, which can also, like the United States, be considered great powers with the ability to shape their future and make their own decisions and do these things. Now, this is undoubtedly creating a crisis within the US, within the US political leadership. And it is one that has not been resolved. And unfortunately, it is a crisis which absolutely does, I think, carry within it the danger of leading to even greater miscalculations and even more reckless actions than the ones that we have seen up to now. Because as the US feels that it is being challenged continuously and successfully by others, there will be within the US a temptation to do something big and dramatic to reestablish itself as the leading power. And that could turn out to be very, 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 go very badly wrong. And that might have very dangerous consequences.